My Packer hat.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Lunch with Lincoln for Monday, October 25th. It is 11:59 in the East, 8:59 in the West. Want to say welcome. I am Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project. Joining me today, Lincoln Project Senior Advisor, Trygve Olson. Trygve, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on, Reed.
So, Trygve, you've got some more sort of scientific, mathematical stuff you want to share with our viewers about how extremism develops. But before we do that, I want to reference the story that Rolling Stone posted late last night, in which they have not one but two different anonymous sources that say that they were personally involved in the planning of January 6th, and that multiple members of Congress, including Paul Gosar, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, were involved in the planning of the insurrection and the storming of the Capitol building that day. A couple of things I noted was, one, that these folks, one of them said that they would testify openly, which I thought was interesting. Two was that, there's always been these rumors that there were members involved, and there's plenty of video like Marjorie Taylor Greene walking out the Trump hotel step, saying just had a great meeting about the trouble we're going to cause tomorrow, whatever. But lastly is that both of these people said they were still Trump supporters after all this.
Yeah.
And so I want to get your sense of the article and how someone comes to a place where they're so offended by violence that they're willing to speak on background to a media outlet, but then still, consider themselves Trump supporters.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I don't know about you. I'm sure you read that the same way. That was a piece of journalism by those reporters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's an amazing piece. And for people who haven't read it, it's Reed retweeted it. You can go to his Twitter feed and see it. I will do that too.
And it's
I think
on the rollingstone.com homepage. It's
yeah.
It's
It is on rollingstone.com. I mean, that's Pulitzer Prize stuff. I think, when I was reading that, what struck me is the level of certainly extremism. And, the final psychological stage of extremism is intolerance.
Mm-hmm.
There certainly is intolerance there, and overconfidence in their opinions, but almost to the point of radicalization. I think the fact that they're cooperating with the committee says a lot. If you read between the lines pretty closely, clearly they've been granted immunity to speak to the committee.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good sign, right? Like it means that they're tipping some people. I also think the fact that an article like that's appearing, with these things, and it makes it clear that there are people cooperating, would suggest to others that's a big flashing red light. You better start cooperating. So those are positive. I think the idea that they set up a command center in the Willard Hotel, for people who know Washington, D.C., I mean, that is power broker central, and they had a command and control to overthrow American democracy at the top of it, in a set of suites. The fact that in the article it discusses the fact that they submitted expenses to the Trump campaign to cover the suites under legal fees. That's crazy too.
Well, and for folks that may not be familiar, the Willard Hotel is, first of all, that's where the expression lobbying came from, because people would stand in the lobby and talk to members of Congress. But if you're standing at the front steps of the Willard looking at the hotel, to your left is the Treasury Department and the White House, and to your right down the road is the U.S. Capitol. So it is sort of at the nerve center of Washington, D.C.
And if you're in the suites at the top of it, you can literally see all three branches of government.
Right.
Well, maybe you can't see the Supreme Court, but you can see the Capitol and the White House. It literally overlooks the White House.
Right.
The fact that they were in those suites doing that, I mean, it's insanity. The fact that people are cooperating, I think we should be heartened by that, that it means the committee is putting it to them. And the fact that, I mean, these people still said they support Trump tells you to a degree about what we're dealing with and the complexities of pushing this back, right? I mean, these guys have immunity, but the fact that they still support what they were doing, it's hard to rationalize, because it isn't rational.
Well, but I guess that's my question to you before we get to the information you've got to share with us. Is that's what we've seen from so many of our friends and colleagues with whom we used to work, was that they have rationalized, either for the last 12 months, for the last 3 years, the last 5 years, the last 6 years since Trump first got into the race in 2015, a reason to either actively support this man and now this movement, or sort of, whistle past the graveyard as it happens, and don't seem to have any compunction about doing so. I mean, where do the people who know better but don't do anything, where do they fit into this whole thing?
Well, some of it, and I think I've talked about this a fair amount, some of it takes time for people to come to cognitive dissonance and say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And I think that's true with anything that becomes, where you have something that psychologically, you on some level in your core, is wrong, but you come up with the ways to rationalize it, right? And that's in essence what they're doing. I also think with when you talk about the operative class, a lot of that has to do with, they rationalize it. I have employees, I have a bottom line, I have bills to pay. What can I do?
Well, I remember a dear friend of mine once said about a guy named Josh Holmes, who is Mitch McConnell's top political strategist. Josh doesn't care about policy at all. The only thing two things he cares about are power and money, which makes sense considering who he works for.
Right. I think there's a lot of people where they come here with good intentions to Washington, D.C. And, you and I were together not long ago, and we were talking about Star Wars, and, the whole premise of Star Wars being the revolutionaries become the empire and give into the dark side, right? Like that tends to happen. And I think if you take a long historical look at the conservative movement, right, what started out as grievances that they felt were real and were considered extremist in the Reagan Revolution, and some grievances which had, if you use tax cuts, right, like the marginal effective tax rate in 1980 was what, 75%.
Right.
And Lafleur came along and said, if we cut taxes, we'll grow the economy. You now have a situation where they've won, and the marginal effective tax rate is half of that. It's maybe 35%.
Right.
And yet
at the top, I think. Yeah.
Right. And they're still fighting that grievance, and it doesn't even conform with Lafleur anymore. But they're busy conforming themselves to it, right?
It also goes into the whole, uber libertarian Ayn Rand, shrink government to the size where you can, drown it in a bathtub.
Right. Well, I had somebody who once said to me that, their suggestion was, and it probably is true, they worked in Congress on the Republican side, and they're like, we're good with Congress not being considered functional and Americans looking down on Congress because we're the people who want limited government. And so, if people don't like government, that's good for us. And the reality is that certainly wasn't Reagan's or Goldwater's vision when they started the movement. It's a movement that became the empire, won, and ran out of ideas. And so what they're left with is trolling the other side. And now what they're left with is we have to do anything we can because we're out of ideas to maintain power. And that ultimately, if you read the Rolling Stone article, leads to a bunch of people, putting a command and control center in the Willard Hotel to overthrow democracy in the United States. It's
there
crazy.
Was something, I was watching Saturday Night Live this weekend, and on the Weekend Update thing, they had a joke about Walmart, and they said, Walmart shoppers storming the Capitol on January 6th, which I think is actually inaccurate. First of all, everybody shops at Walmart because it's Walmart. But also, I think that the folks who stormed the Capitol were not the economically anxious or disadvantaged. These were people who were able to make their way to Washington, D.C. They were able to buy thousands of dollars worth of technical gear, find themselves places to stay, right? These were not folks who climbed out of coal country and said, I'm going to take my country back, right? This was relatively white, affluent, otherwise intelligent people, former military, former law enforcement, engineers, teachers, right? So I think we often do a disservice by saying, well, you know, someone's economically disadvantaged, therefore they must be the people who stormed the Capitol that day.
Yeah, I mean that is taken as an article of faith and on some sides that it's people who have been, you know, have not benefited to a large degree. This was people who are middle class, upper middle class. You had the lady from Texas who took her private jet there, right? Like, I mean, I think, and then yet, if you watch some of the interviews, and you know this because I've said it to you and Rick and others, you know, the part that scared me was when I saw interviews with a lot of the people that were at the rally were saying, you know, this is the most meaningful thing that I've ever done in my life. I'm part of something, right? For people who fit that socioeconomic demographic, to feel like the most meaningful thing in their life was going to the Capitol and participating in an insurrection is, you know, it's a sign of something seriously broke.
Well, I mean, I think,
And
and listen, we could do hours on that alone, right? I mean, there
right,
was a book called Bowling Alone, right, where the breakdown of community is a significant problem in the country.
right,
You know, you have neighbors you never meet. You know, as soon as someone expresses a different political view from you, then, you know, they're immediately shunned.
right.
You know, and because, to your point, and, you know, we can, that's a good segue here, Trygve, to talk about the information you brought us today. So, B, why don't we bring up Trygve's first slide, and Trygve, walk us through what you're seeing here.
Yeah, so I think it's important for people to understand the concept of black swans. So if you have a bell curve of events, right, stuff in the middle is common. And you go out to increasingly rare, which is the black swans, the unexpected. I don't think any of us ever expected that we'd see, you know, insurrectionists at the Capitol, right? So if we go to the next slide, when you're thinking about politics, in our democracy and how it works, right? Democracies are built around consensus. And if you look throughout our history, we certainly have had moments of partisanship one way or the other, but most of the big things fall into the grounds of consensus. We fought the Cold War through consensus. Generally, we fought, you know, on and on. We formed around consensus, and there's inevitably going to be partisanship on both sides, and that isn't really abnormal. It shouldn't be as common as consensus, but it certainly has its place in our system. But then you move out to sort of the gray areas of extremism, radicalization, and violence. And I think when people see events, and when you're thinking about, is what I'm seeing part of this illiberalism, part of this caving and cratering of democracy, you need to think about, what does this curve look like? Because this curve is becoming really skewed with extremism, radicalization, and violence. And when you get to the Rolling Stone piece, that's what you're seeing. I mean, you're seeing members of Congress basically participating in something radical that led to something violent, overthrowing an election. So it's really a simple premise, but it's something that people have to think about, because we really don't see a lot of consensus. We see a few people, Cheney and Kinzinger, for example, but we're, you know, with the 1-6 Commission, they're all working towards consensus. But most of what we have happening now is falling into the partisan extreme, and we're starting to see radical and violent. And so I just thought that would be useful to share in the context of our discussion of the Rolling Stone piece.
So let me ask a couple of questions. One, on the black swan thing. You know, if you think just in the United States alone, not even the world, but in the United States alone, since 2001, you know, we seem to have a black swan like every 5 or 6 years. So at what point does the black swan become the white swan? You know,
well,
like, I mean, and if you take it, you know, internationally, you know, any number of natural disasters, you know, tsunami in South Asia, tsunami in Japan, you know, these are world, you know, for those folks, right? I mean, it's thousands of miles from our shores, but world shattering events for those countries and for those societies. You know, the black swan seems to have become the norm. So is there this sort of, you know, I mean, what do we call them now, right? I mean, they seem to be,
well,
if they're not black, they're at least gray.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot more gray and a lot more randomness probably than we all think about. And inevitably, you're going to end up seeing black swans because there's so many things happening that fall into the normal that eventually you're going to have some black swans. I think in the context of what we've been seeing in the U.S., right? The signs, if somebody would have come, I think back to a conversation you and I had about, I don't know, fall of 15 about Trump and where this was headed. We had a phone conversation. We were like, this isn't good. Like, there's lots of signs, but I don't think either of us would have ever thought that it would culminate in a storming of the Capitol by, people in tack gear to overthrow an election, right? But the signs were even there then that was possible. And part of the reason that black swans occur, the events leading up to them are right there in the open. They're just missed. So they're not unexpected that it would happen. Tsunami in Indonesia or Thailand is inevitably going to happen at some point. But what's unexpected, and the signs are all around that that's going to happen, but they're ignored. And in reality, I think it gets back to your question about some of the people who are like, how do they justify it? They're justifying it by, well, it's not that big a deal. I'm going to ignore it. I'm uncomfortable with the tweets, but I like the policies, right? They're ignoring what leads to the big event that is the black swan.
So let me ask you this. So when you were talking about in the context of this is I'm finally part of something. Is it possible, like, how do we convince otherwise decent Americans, right? How do we convince them that they are part of something and that what we have now, although highly imperfect, is a hell of a lot better than the alternative?
Well, I think it starts on a pretty personalized level for those who've reached the point of being overconfident and intolerant. And we all know those people. We have friends who are those people. We have family who are those people. And when you have to start it with an approach and an understanding that when you present them with facts or truths, they think you're misguided and wrong. So they actually feel like they're doing you a favor when they're saying, oh, the election was stolen. You don't get it, right? So having those kinds of conversations isn't really going to change them towards being.
But I'm not even talking about trying to change people's minds. I'm talking about the folks who otherwise are pro-democracy, who don't want to see what we're seeing here. How do we get those people to feel like that they must be part of something bigger than themselves, that they are part of a grand coalition to help save the country?
Well, we have to figure out ways to make them feel like they're part of an in-group.
Right.
And we have to make them understand. I think about the Orange Revolution that happened in Ukraine, right? I was at some focus groups with people, and somebody came up with the idea, we'll have people wear a color, right? Because lots of people were against what was going on. There's so much crime and corruption in the country, but people were afraid because they felt they were alone. The key to the whole color orange was you can wear the color orange and somebody sitting across the cafe who's got an orange shirt on too, hey, they're with me, right? And if the government comes along and starts arresting everybody who's wearing orange, you can say, this is insane. It's a color. Like, what are you afraid of? We have to figure out ways to make people, we have to build a coalition. And we've been talking about that. We have to make democracy something that is the defining point. And all the other stuff, where you are on the infrastructure bill or a bunch of other pieces of minutia, are not as important. Yeah, they're important, but they're not as important as your, fidelity to democracy. And if you're on team democracy, you become part of it easily by committing to those values and being true to those values, and then bringing to the table what you can bring.
Well, and I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot. We saw each other last week out west, and I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. I mean, what is next November about? It's about power. Who's going to be in charge, right? Who's going to have the ability to directly affect your life, the lives of your friends and your family and your community and everything else. And the whole idea, of course, every idea is imperfect, certainly in conception and almost assuredly in execution. But democracy is the best opportunity we have, as opposed to, you want to let Republicans be in charge. Look what you see going on in Texas, right? Look what you see going on now in Florida, where we can't get the governor of the state, Ron DeSantis, to encourage people to get a free vaccine, but he will encourage people after they're sick with COVID to get a thousands of dollars monoclonal treatment. And he's now offering $5,000 to any law enforcement officer who walked off the job because they didn't want to get the jab. I mean, Trygve, that seems to me to not be small government or a good use of taxpayer money. But now, like, it doesn't matter anymore, right? Maybe that's what you're talking about when you're out of ideas.
Yeah.
The whole concept is just to maintain power, and really power amongst a very small percentage of the people, right? Like, Ron DeSantis doesn't care about the average Floridian. Ron DeSantis cares about the average Republican primary voter next August.
Right. Well, think about that. I mean, what the Republican Party has become for elected officials like Ron DeSantis is, how do I demonstrate that I'm at the core of that in-group of Trumpism and Trump? And so at the heart of it, it's all about owning the other side. Look at how in I am, right? It's the same mentality in junior high that leads some junior high boys to bully somebody else or to do stupid things because they want to be a part of that in-group.
You'll be popular.
If I demonstrate. Yeah, I mean, it's Karate Kid, maybe everything you need to know, right? But sweep
all
the leg.
Life is high school, Trig. All life is high school.
It is. So I think we have to figure out, and part of what we're doing, right, is how you create separation from that in-group with people who want to be part of it but aren't comfortable with what they're doing. Mm-hmm. How do you create that separation? How do you, I mean, there's a lot of people who are trying to have it both ways on the Republican side, Mitch McConnell being example, screaming number one, right? Mm-hmm. I won't talk to Donald Trump ever again. And yet Donald Trump is at the NRSC fundraiser.
Well, and McConnell Rick said Scott, if Trump were the nominee in 24, he'd vote for him.
Right. Or look at Rick Scott, right? Like, he's completely against Sean Parnell and the Pennsylvania primary, yet his consultants. He doesn't have a problem with his consultants working with Parnell, but Kevin McCarthy's goon, Jeff Miller, is going to go out and get anybody who works with Liz Cheney banned from any political work, right? Like, the hypocrisy of that is hilarious on some level. It's
I would say this,
autocrat on another.
It's hilarious, but it's also not unusual in the sort of cartel world that is the Republican, campaign machinery of Washington, D.C.
Right. And to be, it's autocrat 101, right? Because I don't think, Liz Cheney's only crime against the mafia is saying what we saw in 1-6 is wrong. Same with Kinzinger. It isn't votes on policy. But you don't ever have them say, well, I'm comfortable with her speaking the truth about 1-6, but I want to keep her because I like the policy, which is what they do with Trump, right? I don't like the tweets, but I like the policy.
Well, and speaking of that,
is insane.
Like, Trygve, in the Republican House, right? Kinzinger and Cheney, are on the committee, and then last week 9 Republicans, down from 10. Voted to, enforce a congressional subpoena against Steve Bannon. There have to be, I assume, another 25 or 30 Republican House members who think Steve Bannon is bad news, think he's nuts, think he's bad for the country, think Trump is bad for them. Like, where the hell are those guys? I mean, what do they have to lose? They're likely to lose their primaries anyway. Right? Like, what?
Yeah, I mean, democracies die in silence. That's just reality. I can't speak for them. I don't know why. I mean, I thought it was interesting. You talk about ones who are constricting themselves, and I know at one point she went after you on Twitter because she's sensitive about it. But Nancy Mace is one of the people that voted to subpoena Bannon. What's she doing? She's trying to have it both ways, right? And you can't. It's a time for choosing. In corporate America, I mean, this goes throughout America. It's a time for choosing. You're either on team democracy or you're not.
Well, and
And if you're
that's the one thing that we're seeing, I think amongst, and I'm glad that we're seeing this, but it certainly is not far or deep enough into the American psyche, is the talking heads, right? A lot of the smart writers for your big media outlets are finally coming around to the fight at hand.
right,
Now the question is, how do we communicate that fight, to individual Americans and explain to them the stakes that face them, when for the most part, we're all exhausted from the black swans, right? We just want to get back to a maskless, normal society where, like, I don't have to hear about this shit. I can send my kids to school. I can have my friends and neighbors over for a barbecue, and not everything has to be cut down these political lines, right? Like, everybody just wants normalcy back. But unfortunately, I don't think normal, whatever it is, the old normal is long gone, right? And the new normal is yet to be formed. But how do we convince, millions of Americans that they do have a significant role to play in crafting what that new normal looks like?
Well, so let me back up to something you're saying. I mean, people are tired of it. But if we were to talk to Belarusians or Russians or people who live in places with autocratic dictators, the first thing they'd tell you is they're tired of it, because what illiberal and autocrats do, and the forces like Trump, they insert themselves into every aspect of life. Right. They want to be in the middle of every element of society, whether it's sports or entertainment or corporate, right? Like, they want to have no space, and it gets exhausting for people because you can't get rid of these people. And part of the genius of the founding fathers was, I was thinking about this morning, part of the genius of the founding fathers was, we aren't supposed to pay a lot of attention to politics, right? We're supposed to send representatives to Washington or to our state capitals. They work with each other and figure things out, and we don't have to worry about it. But what it's become is like sports. It's literally 24/7 nonstop, coverage of this for a lot of people. And that's not healthy, but it's the reality that we face. And so then, it ends up becoming and then what it becomes is really hard when you have moments like we have right now, where people do have to mobilize to fight back because they've been forced to be engaged all the time on minutia of stuff that doesn't matter. And, again, lots of talk today about the infrastructure bill and what's going on. And to me, that's the process. That's Churchill's sausage being made, right? The truth of the matter is,
listen, let me say this as a guy who has, my dad worked on Capitol Hill for, 20 years, and I was an intern up there. But like, we're into month 5 of this, right? Like, right. I understand that the legislative process, to your point, is intentionally supposed to work slowly. But now it's like, yeah, let's, you got to do something, right?
Well, and I think they're going to, and it probably won't be what a lot of people want, is much for some, too much for others. But that's kind of the way that the process works. But there are 2 things that are going on right now, and I said this when we were on the podcast together, that matter in the big scope of our democracy. And that is what's going on with the 1-6 Commission and trying to hold people accountable. And the Rolling Stone article only takes that to a whole new level, because you literally had people within the congressional branch encouraging an attack by another branch of Congress on itself. That's insane. And that has got to be examined. And then again, we kick the can down the road on the debt ceiling, because that literally could tank the entire economy. Those two issues are massive. And then we've got all the other pieces, and some of it, well, we would like to see it happen faster. We'd like to see slightly different outcomes depending on what our ideological positioning is. Those are processes that get worked out, but they get amplified too because of what we're talking about, because Donald Trump puts himself in the middle of things. Now Ron DeSantis in the middle of everything, right? Those all get amplified too to existential battles when they're not. But the other 2 are really existential to what we are as a country.
Well, we're going to run a minute long here, gang, but speaking of battles that are upon us, so the Virginia governor's race comes down to next Tuesday, November 2nd. This past weekend, former President Barack Obama was in the state campaigning for Terry McAuliffe, and we put together a little something based on the president's remarks. And B, why don't we go ahead and run that as we take us home today?
But when your supporters hold a rally where they pledge allegiance to a flag that was flown at the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, they're the biggest threat to our democracy in my lifetime. When you don't separate yourselves from them, when you don't think that's a problem, well, you know what? That's a problem. Either he actually believes in the same conspiracy theories that resulted in a bomb, or he doesn't believe it, but he's willing to go along with it, to say or do anything to get elected. And maybe that's worse.
The Lincoln Project paid for and is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Well, Trygve, as we go home, I don't think that anybody's laid it out as clearly or as succinctly as President Obama did there in 60 seconds.
No.
And so
No.
I hope that Terry McAuliffe wins on Tuesday because, from my biggest fear, as Rick said a year ago, Glenn Youngkin is the kind of candidate who will take Trumpism, put it through the car wash, and make it seem palatable. And we know how that kind of stuff ends up. Well, Trygve, I want to thank you for joining me today. B and Emily, as always, I want to thank you guys for your help. Just a quick programming note, guys, later this week, we are having a town hall meeting. You can see action.lincolnproject.us/town hall to sign up. I hope all of you will. Until Friday, I am Galen. Thanks again, Trygve, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.